Well, welcome to the Apologetics.com radio, where we challenge believers to think and thinkers to believe. I'm Harry Edwards, your host for the evening, and tonight we will be talking about Justin Brierley's new book titled The Surprising Rebirth of Belief in God, subtitle, Why New Atheism Grew Old and Secular Thinkers Are Considering Christianity Again. I've titled this show, Is the Tide of Unbelief Receding? Now, that's not original. That's somewhere, I read it somewhere in Justin's new book.
That's right.
But I like it. It gives you that picture of the tide that ebbs and flows, and we'll explain why that's significant in a moment. But joining me in the studio this evening is not Jacob Daniel. He's not here with us. We're missing our dear brother. Yeah. I think he's busy speaking somewhere. So we don't have him tonight, but I have Lenny Esposito with me live in person. How are you doing, Lenny?
Good, Harry. How are you? Nice to be here.
Yeah, good. And someone you haven't heard from in a while, Dr. Peter Harris, our apologist fellow from the UK. Can you hear me, Peter?
I can, yes.
Oh,
hello,
great.
Everybody. Good to speak with you again.
Yes. I love the accent. It elevates our show to the next level. Thanks, Dr. Harris.
Not a problem.
I appreciate you, brother. So, Happy New Year. This is our first show of the year. So, Lenny, how was your New Year? Pretty good?
It was good. Spent some time in New Orleans at New Orleans Baptist Theological Seminary doing a Defend conference, and been busy with that, planning, of course, an upcoming conference here in Southern California, March 1st and 2nd, Dare to Defend, and you can go to daretodefend.com, find out more about that, where we have Greg Gansel will be speaking, Neil Shenvi, Fuzz Rana, Ken Samples, so a bunch of guys.
Who's who, here. Huh? All right.
Yeah.
Well, hopefully I can check your outfit out when the time comes. That's going to be fun. Peter, how are you doing over there in England?
I'm very well, thank you. Yes, I've had a very restful Christmas and a very pleasant start to the new year, so thank you very much for asking.
Good. I know in your bio, like on our site, you said that you're working to be a lay preacher at the Anglican Church. How's that coming along?
That's right.
Are you...
Well,
are you done?
I'm a minister at my local parish church, and I regularly preach there. So yes, I've graduated successfully, and I'm preaching tomorrow on the presentation of Jesus at the temple. So I'm looking forward to that very much indeed.
Oh, that's great. That's wonderful to hear, Peter. Well, let me tell you, our listeners, that this whole show came about because Peter wrote an article, and the article is about Justin's new book, and it's a review of, well, he titled it The Surprising Rebirth of Belief in God, Why New Atheism Grew Old and Secular Thinkers Are Considering Christianity Again, by Justin Brierley, reviewed. So thanks to your article, I got intrigued. I read it, and I go, wait, I need to get that book. So I did get the book, and Lenny and I read it, and we loved it. But we want to start the show by getting your take on it, Peter, because you wrote an excellent review on it, which, by the way, if you're listening to this, you can read that on apologetics.com, published there. It's a front page. You can't miss it. And I would encourage you guys to read it and pick up the book. But let's start with you, Peter. Tell us maybe why you wrote that review. You had some good things to say about the book, and you had some things that you wish Justin had included in the book. So let's start there. Why did you write the review?
I suppose it's because I very much enjoyed the book, and I am hoping that what it's saying is true about Western civilization. But at the same time, I do have some reservations about what it's saying as well. But I need to put a caveat on that. I hope that my main criticism, is untrue. I hope to be proven wrong. I do hope it is the case that the tide of faith is coming back in, but I don't necessarily see that Justin makes a conclusive case that it is, I think he's open to some criticism on that front. But I do hope to be proven wrong on one of the few occasions when I want to be proven wrong.
Yeah,
I hope you're wrong too, with all due respect, right? But yeah, we can talk more about that. But what? Okay, go ahead, Lenny.
So for folks who may not be familiar, Justin Brierley was host of a UK radio show, Christian radio show, which Christian radio in the UK is interesting in its own right, because unlike the United States, you don't have dedicated Christian radio stations. You have to buy time and compete with secular outfits and secular markets as well. But for 15 years, Justin did...
17.
Was it 17 years?
Yeah.
He hosted a show called Unbelievable, which it was about an hour and a half in length, became very, very popular as a podcast, really grew in international acclaim there by bringing some of the foremost Christian thinkers and some of the foremost atheist or secular thinkers who would sit on different sides of a specific topic, and they would engage one another. And these were really topics on everything, not merely the existence of God, but very specific, granular, is miracles rational to believe in? How do we understand gender issues? Anything the church was talking about, he engaged for several, like I said, for many years. And he became familiar with the different arguments that many of the top apologists, top defenders of the Christian faith, philosophers would make. And so he has since stepped down from that show, but what we're seeing now is, in these books, is kind of the fruition of those years that he spent understanding and engaging and facilitating the conversations between these individuals. So I think that's a good backstory to unpack.
Yes, thanks, Lenny, for that. And he is someone, you can go back, and I would encourage our listeners to watch his shows. I'm sure they're online everywhere.
Yeah, most of them are radio, so most of them are audio. He has, the Templeton Foundation gave him a grant to do several video, he called the Big Conversations, and I think there were 10 or 15 of those. But for the full 17 years, it was a weekly radio broadcast that was then turned into a podcast, and there's tons of those topics that are out there.
In fact, he wrote his first book, I think, is titled, I might botch the exact title, but it's like, After Speaking with Atheists, Why Am I Still a Christian? Right?
Yeah,
Something like that.
Unbelievable. Why, after 10 years of interviewing atheists, I still believe in Christianity. Yeah.
Right. I thought that was a provocative title. All right, so what are some of the things we like about this book? Peter, let's start with you.
Yes. Well, I think, first of all, I like what Justin says about why New Atheism has failed. He talks about New Atheism imploding, and he gives a number of reasons why that is. And I think the main reason he focuses on is the internal divisions within New Atheism. And one of the main arguments they had among themselves was whether they were to be a purely atheist organization, just focusing on criticizing religious belief and reducing its influence in the public sphere, or whether it would also be a movement that would be campaigning for various social justice issues. And that division became very acrimonious, with New Atheist leaders falling out with each other. I would add to that, I think New Atheism really lost a lot of energy and force when Christopher Hitchens died in 2011. I think he was probably their best spokesperson. He was certainly a very confident public speaker, very polished, very refined, and I think with his death, they lost a major voice. But I think also what Justin says, quite interestingly, is that New Atheism presented a materialist interpretation of life, and that's a very depressing view of life, mainly the notion that your life ends when you die, and people are looking for a different, shall we say, story, to use Justin's own term. I don't think a depressing piece of fact or a depressing outlook on life is necessarily untrue because it's depressing. But I do think that if people are finding it hard to accept a materialist, physicalist view of the universe, then they will be open to what we know is the truth, and that is that there is a God who loves us and with whom we can be reconciled through the death and resurrection of his Son. So if they're looking for a better story, which is also happens to be true, then Christianity is there for them. So I think that's one of the great strengths of his book, and I think that, although I've been critical of it, I still think it's an excellent book and well worth reading.
Yes.
Yeah, I think one of the problems with the New Atheist movement, of course, they were much more belligerent than prior movements. A Voltaire would come out and he would make proclamations about the advancement of the Enlightenment project and how reason will overshadow faith. But Voltaire also famously said, "I may disagree with what you say, but I'll defend to the death your right to say it." That's not what the New Atheists did. They actually, said faith, belief in religion is evil, right? How religion poisons everything. And Christopher Hitchens made that point famous. Of course, Dawkins, in his opening to the God Delusion, has this screed against the Christian God being maniacal, most malevolent, the oft-quoted paragraph that he uses. And I think that rubs some people the wrong way. Matter of fact, I remember reading one article when an atheist was saying, "I told my friends, do you think I'm an atheist?" And they said, "No, you're not mad enough. You're not an angry enough person to be an atheist." So that reputation kind of preceded the New Atheists. But I also think that most people, and this is proven through, if you look at just all aspects of human history, we intuitively understand that there is a spiritual side to who we are. There's things like beauty and pathos and yearnings and a desire to attain something higher than ourselves. There's a spiritual aspect to what it means to be human, and New Atheism is completely bankrupt in answering that need, that fundamental aspect of human nature. So that's one thing that actually Justin doesn't talk about in his book per se, but I think it's another fundamental aspect of why this movement had, it came on very quickly, shone very bright for a very little time, and then ultimately caved in on itself. And so that it is an interesting point.
Right. There are several things I like about the book. I did enjoy it very much, and it speaks to the experience he's had interviewing all of the luminaries of our time. So very impressive, right? So he got a doctorate education right there in the 17 years he was doing the show. But I thought he made a very good observation by pinning the rise of religious discussion on an atheist, Richard Dawkins. He kept saying the fact that he sponsored that billboard on buses, and the billboard goes something like this: "There's probably no God. Now stop worrying and enjoy your life."
Yeah.
And that, at the outset, it seems like it's a slap on the face of Christianity, and it on some level it is, but it actually, what it did was it sparked a national conversation,
right?
Probably a global conversation, to the point where Justin notes in his book that even Christian organizations started supporting, funding that slogan. I thought that was interesting.
Well, it's interesting if you watch car commercials. The Hondas and the Toyotas don't ever compare themselves to any other vehicle. They don't have to, but it's the other vehicles who says, we're, cheaper than a Honda and we're almost as good, right? So you get that kind of feeling from this, there's probably no God. It's the same kind of thing. It's like any publicity is good publicity.
Right. The other thing I like about the book was I thought he did a very good job of outlining what's going on in the apologetics world and how it interacts with the secular mindset out there, the secular zeitgeist, and how when you see one side pitted against the other, you see how bankrupt the other side is. And these are the best of either world, the Christian world and the secular world. And like you were saying, Lenny, the secular worldview doesn't offer anything that could replace Christianity. And I like how Brierley at some point observed that, as Os Guinness would say, we're cutting off the roots of, we're cut flowers. And so some of these bright minds are enjoying the fruits of Western Civ, but they fail to realize that it is connected to the Judeo-Christian tradition. So I thought that's good of him to expose that, and in fact, a lot of his guests just kind of came to that conclusion all by themselves. And so a lot of I like what he emphasized the fact, the author emphasized the fact that a lot of these strident atheists, they've relaxed a little bit on their position, to the point that they're no longer attacking Christianity, and they're allowing for, they're not Christians per se at this point, but now they're allowing the credit that's due Christianity. And if you go away with Christianity, then they are fearful for what the world is going to be, because it can't be a no-God worldview. That doesn't make sense.
I'm going to ask Peter, the title is The Surprising Rebirth of Belief in God, and what Brierley does is he points to several key non-believers that, as you say, are kind of shifting in their thinking. Now, Peter, what was your takeaway on, say, the Jordan Petersons or the Tom Hollands or the Douglas Murrays of the world that Justin pulls on to kind of try and bolster his thesis here?
Well, he uses them in an interesting way. I mean, he refers to Tom Holland as the historian who has reminded us all that Western civilization is the creation of Christianity, primarily in its morals, which I think feeds into the political structures that we have, but also modern science as well. So all of these thinkers are saying that even modern secularism is a descendant of Christianity because of the notion that all humans are inherently valuable, which is a Jewish/Christian moral value. It's right there at the beginning of Genesis, where we are told that we're made in the image of God. So that there's quite a few people that he refers to in his book. It's a real stellar list of intellects. So obviously Tom Holland, Jordan Peterson, Douglas Murray, Peter Boghossian, Barry Weiss, David Rubin, Germaine Greer, Brett Weinstein, David Suchet, the British actor, and also the British novelist Paul Kingsnorth. Now, Suchet and Kingsnorth are both Christians, but the other people on the list are not. And he's very clearly delineated some very important and widely listened to public intellectuals who are, as you say, giving Christianity the credit for creating, I think, a remarkably good society that we can all enjoy and which we all share through the various fundamental cultural assumptions that we make. But I think the important point is that most of the people on that list are not Christians. They're very interested in Christianity. I think we could add to the list Ayaan Hirsi Ali, who has recently said that she takes Christianity very seriously. But most of them are not Christians. And the point that I would want to make is that a renewed interest in Christianity as a cultural force is not the same as a revival of faith. Now, it could lead to it, and I hope it does. I hope these people are being used by God to open the door to a restoration of a widespread faith in God within Western culture. But I don't necessarily see it as following on from that. So I hope I'm wrong. As I said at the start, I really sincerely hope I'm wrong and that Justin is right. But I don't think you can necessarily say that will follow on.
Right.
And I do make a point in my review that there have been other times when, very well-respected, very influential thinkers and artists and creators and so on have embraced the Christian faith, but it hasn't led to a general revival. So I point out in my review the way C.S. Lewis, Dorothy L. Sayers, J.R. Tolkien, Owen Barfield, from a British perspective, were very interested in Christianity. They all become Christians. They have a national voice during World War II. You see people coming to cathedrals to pray for God's rescue from Nazi Germany. And that temporarily halts the decline in church attendance in Britain. But once that era comes to an end, attendance, which is not necessarily the same as having faith in God.
Exactly.
People go to church for other reasons, but that decline continues. It accelerates in the 1960s, it accelerates again in the 1990s, and at the moment the mainstream churches, of which I'm a member, are really struggling at the moment, and it is predicted that they will probably end by the middle of this century, although other Christian denominations are managing either to hold on to their people or even grow, particularly the charismatic and Pentecostal churches.
Or the locus of something like the Anglican Church will shift to Nigeria, some of the African nations who are really seeing a revival. And I see really there's even a parallel in the Old Testament if you look at, say, the revival that King Josiah starts, right, where Judah is apostatizing, yet he knocks down all the temples and the pagan altars, really starts to clean up the temple, and Hezekiah, right, both of them were engaged in this idea. And because of that, you do spawn a Daniel and those guys, but the overall culture still, after they were gone, fell back into apostasy, fell back into idol worship, and ultimately were judged for it.
Yeah, Peter, I thought that observation that you made was a good one. I did appreciate that, because when you think about just recent history, like you mentioned, C.S. Lewis, Tolkien, and these were bright luminaries and very influential, and yet that didn't cause a revival. Who are we to think today that might happen? But the other interesting thing I thought was in Justin's conversation with Douglas Murray, it was the atheist that said that maybe there might be a resurgence in Christianity.
Yeah.
I thought that was interesting, right? When he made mention of the ebb and flow of the sea, and it's like, oh, okay, yeah. He's not only open to it, but he might become one. He might become a Christian. I thought that was fascinating.
Yes, I mean...
Yeah, go ahead.
Sorry, Tom, please, sorry. Okay, yes, the image or the metaphor of the tide of faith, as I'm sure everyone's aware, comes from a poem by Matthew Arnold, which was published in 1851, called Dover Beach. And Arnold regrets the decline of Christianity, and he refers to it as the tide going out. And that sort of surprised me, because I normally assume that the 19th century is a time of great Christian commitment, Victorian England and all that. But even Arnold could detect that decline of influence of Christianity, way back in the mid-19th century. But Murray said to Brierley, look, Justin, he said, tides also come back in. And of course that is true. And that's where Justin got the idea from, that Christianity may be coming back in, but not just an interest in Christianity or a greater warmth towards Christianity, but an actual embracing of faith in God, of trusting in God, of being saved, of becoming a disciple. And I think that's a whole new ballgame in comparison to having a benevolent, accepting view that Christianity has done a lot of good to shape the West. I think the two are separate.
Right. No, that's good. I know we have one more minute before we go on a station break, but I want our listeners and our panelists to just start thinking about this whole idea, which in the book, Justin Brierley did mention this quote, which I appreciate, by G.K. Chesterton, just making a comment about how maybe Christianity has this ebb and flow. And Chesterton said, Christianity has died many times and risen again, for it had a God who knew the way out of the grave. I thought that was brilliant.
Yeah, that was brilliant.
I like that.
Yeah, absolutely.
Very appropriate. So I hear the music, which means it's the cue for us to go on a station break. You have been listening to the apologetics.com radio. My guests this evening, Peter Harris and Lenny Esposito. We're talking about Justin Brierley's new book, The Surprising Rebirth of Belief in God. We will be back after a few messages. Well, welcome back to the second half hour of the apologetics.com radio show, where we challenge believers to think and thinkers to believe. And I am joined in the studio with my good friend Lenny Esposito, and we have a special guest on the line, Dr. Peter Harris from the UK. He's one of our staff apologists, our fellow in the UK, and he writes a lot of great articles which you should read, and they get published on our site. So, Peter, thank you for that. And
no worries.
Yes, but before we get into our topic, I'd just like to remind our listeners that we are supported entirely by your generous donations. If you find our shows valuable and wish to see it continue, please support us by liking and sharing this on YouTube, Facebook, Twitter, and other social media outlets. You can also help us with our radio costs by going to our website, www.apologetics.com, and click on that donate button. Any amount helps, and your partnership will help us remain on the air. So, I was just thinking, Peter, that we're live, and it's like 8:30 in the morning UK time, and
That's right. Yeah.
You can let your friends know to just go to KKLA, right? KKLA.com. That's the name of the radio station we're broadcasting from right now. And they can click on that link, like listen live or something like that. And so that's kind of fun. We have been talking about Justin Brierley's new book. It got published last fall, I believe. The title is The Surprising Rebirth of Belief in God. I highly recommend it. I think Justin does several things here, but the two big things that come to mind is he traces contemporary apologetics, a little bit of a recent apologetics history of why that phenomena might have happened, that rebirth and interest in Christianity. And I like how he pins it again to the four horsemen of the new atheist movement. Do you know them by name? I know Richard Dawkins,
Hitchens, Harris, and Dennett. Matter of fact, that was first came out in an article from Wired magazine in 2006. That's where those four guys were first kind of promoted, and that's where they became kind of noted as the leaders in this new movement.
So was it really a serious organization?
It was. They were all obviously friends, and several of them were. Harris is American, but Hitchens and Dawkins are both from Britain, and they were both part of the British Humanist Association.
Yes.
But because they were all kind of writing tomes that were coming out within a year or two of each other, and they were making a lot of headway in secular circles, and that's what drew attention to them. But more interestingly, while he doesn't dwell too much on that, I mean, he spends the Rise and Fall of New Atheism is chapter 1. One of the interesting things about this book is it's not just simply an analysis of what happened in the culture, but there's actually apologetic arguments.
Yes, that's the second thing I was going to say. Yes, exactly.
And they're they're very relevant and very contemporary. They're not the apologetics arguments maybe that you've only heard 30 years ago. They're kind of fresh, which was another nice aspect of this book.
I think that's the major nugget, the gem. If you're looking for a new apologetics approach, I would recommend those chapters where he deals a lot with longing and meaning and the existential questions that people have, which I think, and I'd be talking to my friends about this, I think in this day and age, the whole quest to find out if God exists or not, I think that's a little bit past our time now. I think, if anything, people are religious or spiritual. They don't care if God exists or not. To them, it doesn't matter. But for them, some deity, some force exists, and that's good enough. So it's not like they're staunch atheists. And I think today, if you label yourself an atheist, that's probably an intellectual kind of a pursuit. And again,
Well, you hear all the people trying to distance themselves even from the label, right? Well, I'm an
Yes.
agnostic atheist.
Yes.
Like there's different aspects of atheism.
Yeah. Now, Peter, I was going to ask you this. I wonder how much of Justin's analysis here of, let's say, the optimistic kind might be colored by his experience over there in Great Britain. Because while I can see that happening also here in the U.S., but I wonder if a lot of his analysis is based on his UK experience. What do you think? And Lenny, chime in too. What do you think? What do you guys think?
Yeah, I think it may be. I think he's probably, what he's saying applies to Western civilization generally. It's very hard, though, to pinpoint what he would be so optimistic about in Britain. Certainly, the first time in British history, less than 50% of people have identified themselves in a national census as Christian. It's now down to 49%. But on the other hand, he might be taking his optimism from the fact that most people still regard themselves as spiritual. So they may not be, let's say, part of an organized church or institution, religious institution, but they're still very open to the idea, as was said earlier in the broadcast, that there is something more than the material world, because we seem to have desires for things that cannot be satisfied by the material world, which suggests that there is another realm that can satisfy those desires, which of course is the famous argument from desire that C.S. Lewis uses. So I think his optimism might be coming from that, but I think principally he's optimistic because of the change in attitude from that very harsh anti-Christian tone of New Atheism to a more welcoming, a more open consideration of the good things, the outstanding, sublime things that the Christian civilization has done. And I think what Brierley really likes is the fact that Christian civilization is so different to any other civilization. And this is sort of pointed out by Tom Holland in his book Dominion, where he says that if you look at the ancient world, their outlook, their morals are so much different and so much inferior, should we say, to Christian morality as well. So Julius Caesar presents himself as a possible Roman emperor on the basis that he's killed 1 million people in a war in France, whereas today, no one would ever dare say that. In fact, they'd probably find themselves in the International Court of Human Rights in The Hague for behaving like that. So, Holland says, well, I'm not a Christian, but my whole world is suffused with Christian principles. So I think that's where Justin is taking his optimism. But the public intellectuals that he mentions as being a cause of his optimism are not only British, but they are also American and Canadian as well. So it's a real sense of the Western world waking up to the fact that it is based on Christianity, something that Friedrich Nietzsche was saying back in the 19th century. And I lament the fact that Justin doesn't say more about Nietzsche, who himself found it troubling that Western civilization is so Christian, and said that, with the decline of Christianity, there has to arise a new morality which will be forged by moral geniuses, these free spirits that he refers to. But of course, Brierley says, well, actually, no, this is a move of God because of God's love, his grace, and his sovereignty.
I like, Peter, that you pointed that out, because I feel like if you talk to any any student of philosophy on maybe a sophomoric level, especially if they're coming from a fundamentalist Christian upbringing, Nietzsche is always the bad guy. Like there's nothing good about him. But you're right, though, that he did ask the pertinent questions of his time.
He was honest.
He was honest.
He was at least honest with it.
And when he declared that God is dead, it was a lament, actually. Yeah. It's not like a triumphal thing that, yes, atheism has succeeded and we've killed God.
You have no idea what you've done. Yeah.
Right. But it's more of a lament that secularism has killed God, and it was a bad thing for Nietzsche. Yeah.
Yes. And Nietzsche says, if you kill God, or you kill the belief in God or the idea of God, you can't hold on to the morality that went with that God.
Right.
which is what secular humanists are trying to do. They're trying to hold on to a Christian morality but remove God from the picture. So when they say all human beings are valuable, that comes straight out of Genesis. So their project is going to fail in Nietzsche's eyes. If you remove the metaphysical underpinnings of a moral belief system, then the morals also will collapse as well. And what will we then have as the basis of our morality? It will be determined not so much by Christian idealism and Christian altruism. It will be decided by who's the most powerful and who's the loudest. And I think there's some evidence that is already happening now within British society and other societies.
Yeah, and to your point, I did find it fascinating that he specifically talked with Peter Boghossian, and if you knew Boghossian in say 2012, I mean, he and James Lindsay, their whole point was to go around to college campuses and debate Christians. And Boghossian comes out with a book on how to create an atheist. He kind of corners this idea of street epistemology, which is how to argue Christians out of their beliefs. So his whole enterprise was to disavow people of their faith, to basically pull them away from their belief system. And he then says, you know what? I'm not doing that anymore. My Christians are actually the ones who care enough about reason, care enough about the Western libertarian project to allow reason to thrive and flourish. They're actually an ally more than an enemy, and I'm not going to go after them anymore. We have other issues that are far more pertinent for us to tackle, and we can tackle them together. And that's really amazing to see a guy kind of swivel on that point to that degree, because Boghossian, even on Brierley's show, he was facing off against Tim McGrew, and they spent an entire hour arguing on is belief an unjustified claim to knowledge, or is it something more than that? What do you mean by faith? Is faith an unjustified belief or not? And so it is an amazing change, and I can kind of see some of Brierley's optimism in seeing people do that. But as you say, it may just be a mode of wistfulness where some of those stalwarts are kind of gasping for a return to those values that they cherish, even though they have no grounding for those values. And similarly, he points to Antony Flew, which was interesting, which kind of precedes this whole effort. Actually, Flew's a little earlier. But you start to wonder, how popular are those? Because most of these individuals, as is pointed out as well, are their values swing into a more conservative camp. Even a Dave Rubin. So the guys who were previously left are now kind of more politically on the right. And that becomes an interesting dynamic as well.
That's a perfect segue. You're reading my mind here, Lenny, because I wanted to get Peter's opinion on this. In the article that you wrote, Peter,
yes,
you mentioned, here, let me quote this. Brierley acknowledges this, and this is the, let's see. Well, let me back up here. You said, Peter, it is of note that most of the above intellectuals are highly critical of progressive politics in the form of transgenderism, and some have taken contemporary feminism to task. Brierley acknowledges this in his short biographies on each thinker, but avoids asking the contentious question as to whether a Christian consciousness or one that is sympathetic to Christianity is antithetical to radical leftism. So I thought that was interesting. I didn't know that about Justin Brierley, but you said that he avoids to take a political stance on his shows, so he tries to avoid that, right? Is that your sense?
Yes, he does, and I think that's part of his way of bringing people together. He's very self-effacing as a radio host, which obviously makes the atheist feel, or the agnostic feel able to come on the show because they don't feel they're not only arguing against their debate opponent, but they're also arguing with the radio host as well. So I think that's partly his instinct as a radio host and as someone who is an evangelist as well. He's very much an evangelist at heart. But I would want to ask him that question. Does he think that being a Christian means that you cannot engage in radical left-wing politics? And I think he probably would say yes, because radical leftism does go hand in hand with atheism. Certainly the manifestations of communism that we saw in the 20th century were very violent atheist in their nature. The League of the Militant Godless that persecuted the Orthodox Church during Stalin's ascendancy and so on, the shooting of priests and believers by Lenin's secret police, the Cheka. So yeah, I'm just curious to know what Brierley would himself say on that matter, and I think that maybe he could have said something in the book.
Yeah,
maybe not.
That would be nice. You're right. Then it would be a perfect book if he did that. So
Yes.
you know, I mean, your comment there, the one that I just read, reminds me even that the church here in the U.S. tends to avoid politics, and that P word, politics, is deemed to be a dirty word many times. And so it is kind of regretful when a lot of the political content actually intersect with Christianity. So let's say, for instance, if abortion becomes politicized, then the church tends to be silent on that, and it becomes a private matter. And it is unfortunate, but that is the case here. I imagine it's the case there as well.
Yes, it is. Although we do have a rather interesting situation in Britain. We do have a secular government. Tony Blair, one of our former prime ministers, his media spokesman, a man called Alistair Campbell, said, we don't do God. In other words, although Blair, I think, has a Catholic faith, he didn't bring God into any of his discourses whilst he was prime minister. But we do have an interesting situation in the sense that bishops of the Anglican Church in Britain do have a place in the House of Lords, which is the second government chamber that scrutinises legislation coming from the House of Commons. And they do make political statements. They are often critical of the government. So there is some politicisation within the structure of the church. But I think, yes, customarily, ministers will avoid talking about politics with their congregations because it can be very divisive. And I certainly don't make political points in any of my sermons because that might alienate some people, and therefore they might fixate on what I'm saying about politics rather than what I'm trying to say about how to live a Christian life, who God is, what salvation is, and so on and so on.
So perhaps just like you, Justin's also being wise about those kinds of things, just unnecessarily alienating people. I get it. But
yes,
at some point, we have to really dig deeper here. And this is like a sermon for all of us, right? At some point, we have to be the Daniels. We have to be.
Well, yeah. There's a philosophy in hockey. If you're ever interested in ice hockey, one of the things that the coaches will tell you is get good on your skates. Practice your skating a lot. Most people want to, make sure that they could shoot the puck and they can get it in this corner of the net or that corner of the net. But the philosophy is, look, the puck handling will come. That's just a natural part of the game. But you have to know how to maneuver on the skates. You have to have this foundation. You have to have the stability there. And I think it's the same with Christianity. If we can get people foundationally grounded in the essentials of the faith, in the idea of the resurrection, of Jesus being our primary example in life, then the specific issues that as they come up, those will come. Those will grow naturally out of one's discipleship. But it's important to start with the foundation and fundamental. You don't want to slip and fall because you can't take any shots, right? Similarly, you want to make sure that people are, because again, a lot of these folks that Brierley is talking about, they're not Christians. They like the idea, but there's usually something holding them back. Thomas Nagel had said, he was impressed that some of the smartest people he knew had become Christians. But he said, I know that if I become a Christian, then I'm morally accountable, and I just don't want that yet, And so it wasn't an intellectual barrier. It was a heart issue. And so sometimes that's what we have to focus on first. And once we get through that, then the other issues can kind of follow suit.
Yeah. Toward the end of your article, Peter, you made you said one final point in closing. That's the second to the last paragraph here. And I like what you said here about Justin maybe painting so broad a brush to have all materialists be engaged in moral relativism, but you're saying that that's not the case, right? Would you explain or expound on that? Like, who are some of the materialists who aren't moral relativists?
Yes. There is I think the main name that I can think of is Kai Nielsen, the philosopher who doesn't accept that atheism leads to moral relativism. He argues that he's a moral absolutist, and also he has argued for the existence of non-material realities. So although the universe is godless, existence is godless, the stuff of which we are made is not just merely matter, it's also non-material entities as well. And although I'm not necessarily saying that those atheists are right, but I do think it's important that although probably most atheists are materialists and some are moral relativists, there are a lot who are moral absolutists, and there are some, probably a few, who are also believers in non-material realities. And I think that would actually provide a more accurate picture of atheists. I think we have to get them right. I think we have to understand their arguments with accuracy before we can then really accurately dismantle what they're saying.
Right. No, that's a good observation. In fact, that's also probably really wise advice for just any budding apologist, because it's so easy to make some of these arguments and with a triumphalist attitude say, you must be a Hitler then. If you're an atheist, you're going to be a Hitler, that type of thing. Or you're just we just degrade them and insult them. But a lot of atheists, part of their ethos is to live a good life and to be nice, gentle, loving, all those kinds of things. And I have to take them at their word and that they are sincere. Now, like Lenny mentioned a while ago, the grounding issue is
that's
always
the problem.
That's the big problem.
Yes.
But we don't have to shove it in their face in the beginning, I think,
But it can lead to something down the road, and this is kind of the point of the book, is once you start taking away that foundation, then it becomes much easier. For example, look at the current Hamas-Israel conflict. And so many, I was actually shocked because in the 70s and 80s, when you had the different movies on the Diary of Anne Frank, and you had Shoah, and you had even Steven Spielberg's Schindler's List, right? You have to say, who would be pro-Nazi? Who would be for, clearly the Jewish people were, how can anti-Semitism even thrive? I mean, it just seemed inconceivable to me that we would ever be able to come back to an era where people would champion those who would do acts of despicable, unspeakable evil. And yet now we have Hamas who did acts of despicable evil, unspeakable evil. And there's pro-Palestinian rallies happening with no regard and justification because, they are the oppressed class. And there's some kind of, and when you're starting to call Jews Nazis, you are just very, very confused in your terminology. But the point being is, when you've unhitched your moral grounding from something like God, then of course you're going to get this relativistic response. And look what it produces, which is actually really scary for our society.
Yes. When they call evil good and good evil, that's where we are right now. We've got just a couple minutes, Peter, and then we will end the show. But I thought before we end the show, I do want to have our listeners know this study that was done by an Oxford psychologist, McElchrist, I think is his last name, Dr. McElchrist. Would you talk briefly about his findings about the whole left brain and right brain issues, how as a culture, probably since the Enlightenment, we've focused too much on the left brain. And I think Justin writes here and quotes this Oxford psychologist that because we're so left brain and we've neglected the arts, the emotions, that I think Justin used the word that cultures get destroyed. Would you comment a little bit on that study about the left brain and the right brain?
Yes, I think this is, for me, the most interesting thing that Justin says, and it's a real reminder to myself as an apologist. The psychologist in question, Ian McElchrist, he goes along with the idea that the brain is separated into two hemispheres. The left deals with reason, the right deals with imagination, and cultures that don't honor both sides of the brain are impoverished. So if you don't honor reason, you're prone to superstition and irrational behavior. If you don't honor the imagination, then your life becomes very prosaic and grey and dull. But what Justin does is he takes this idea and he says, we apologists, we are very much focused on reason, presenting arguments for the existence of God, or at least saying that it's plausible to say that God exists. But what he says is that we also have to make people realize that it's desirable that Christianity is true. Not only that it is true, but actually make them want it to be true. And in order to do that, you have to appeal to their imaginations. You have to appeal to the right-hand side of their brain. And I thought to myself, that really helps me, because I spent a lot of time, arguing for the existence of God on the basis of rationality, attempting to disprove the notion that Christianity is inherently irrational and so on. But what work have I done to tell stories, tell the Christian story, and make people see how desirable it is that an eternal God who loves us beyond our ability to understand exists. That's incredibly desirable in my opinion.
I love that. That reminds me of a quote by Pascal as well, that we should want to make Christianity be wanted by our listeners. Yes, so
yes.
Peter, it's been a pleasure talking to you all the way from the UK. Thanks for being on our show. And I know we are ending already in the next few seconds. So again, hope you have a good weekend. And
thank you.
We'll talk again soon, Peter. Thank you.
Thank you very much. God bless you all.
God
Bye.
bless you too. Lenny, thank you also for being a guest. Or you're not a guest, but being a part of our panel this evening. So you've been listening to apologetics.com radio, where we challenge believers to think and thinkers to believe. Our hope is that you've learned some aspect about the Christian worldview that strengthens your faith and make you want to learn more. So thank you again for listening, and good night.